A stereotype and an archetype, there are two different things, although you may never have separated them in your own mind. An archetype is like a protagonist or an antagonist or a reason character or an emotion character. They represent a function in the structure of the story, and its identifiable function, a mechanism, as it were. A stereotype can be some structural aspects, but it's also almost always grouped with particular storytelling aspects, like how you would expect a nerd to appear, or how you would expect a bully to act, in addition to representing maybe the bully is the protagonist, maybe the bully is the emotion character. A bully could be any one of those structurally, but a bully still has this overbearing personality, and that describes the nature of the character in a storytelling sense. Perhaps the clothes they wear, perhaps a physical manifestation or an accent or anything of that nature. The fact that we would expect somebody to be male or female or Catholic or Protestant or Jewish or whatever. It doesn't, all the storytelling aspects create stereotypes that we expect to see, but underneath that are archetypes. Now, in terms of reception theory, in our clips, reception of character, suppose you have a known actor. Well, he's going to be something of a stereotype. You're going to expect certain things from him because of what he's done before. And you might try typecasting him by putting into a similar story as you've seen him before, or you might cross-type him. And in a novel, you might have this character involved in a kind of plot or certain situations, or take certain approaches that are the same or different, typing or cross-typing, than they have been in previous novels that you've written or someone else has written. Let's take a look here and see an example of typecasting. So we now see the softer side of Schwarzenegger. What did that do? Well, in the movie, it actually didn't do too well because people stayed away from it in droves because they didn't want to see this guy doing this kind of a role. And yet, for his career, it did a wonderful thing because it changed people's perception of the limitations of him as an actor from just being a one-line action hero to having some depth as an actor, and allowed him to then expand into other roles that were progressively more acceptable, more comedic roles, rather than just being the washed-up action hero of years past that he might have become. So it was a good career move for him, but actually a fairly poor move for the producers of the motion picture. Now, let's talk a moment about reception of theme. Reception of theme. Of course, there's much more we could talk about with characters, but we just don't have the time. Reception of theme. Well, there are favored standards of evaluation. Theme is all about value standards. Which is the best way to go using a particular value standard versus another value standard? Which one should be your credo? Which one should be your belief system? And it's an emotional argument, but culturally we favor particular standards of evaluation. We don't want to look at something and evaluate it in that area because we don't come in contact with it. Certain things we come in contact with every day, and so we exercise ourselves as a culture wanting to look over those value standards and interpret all kinds of different situations from that point of view. Every culture has blind spots, though, because while you're looking in one direction, what's happening? You're not looking in the other direction. And cultures which indoctrinate us in certain ways of thinking, when we're using certain standards to evaluate, other areas we don't evaluate at all. And sometimes big inequities can build up behind us, and all of a sudden, we turn around and boom, it hits us in the face. Well, if you can find a big inequity like that, building up in an area that the culture has not really perceived yet, and get a book written or a movie into production that hits that right in the heart and addresses it just about the time that the culture notices it's there, you can ride a wave of success. Lawrence Kasdan did this in The Big Chill. In The Big Chill, it's dealing with people who grew up thinking they were full of ideals and they were going to change the world, and gradually along the way they became incorporated into society, doing the same kinds of things in business and the same kinds of dirty tricks, and ignoring the poor and the needs of everyone else that the establishment had done when they vowed to overthrow it. They vowed to change things. And suddenly they have to face that because of the death of one of their members, the first one to die. They have to say, hey, we've become who we were fighting against. We're no longer who we thought we were. Well, in the age of the 80s, when people were just waking up to the fact that they were starting to have all these yuppie accoutrements and have the good executive jobs and spend all the money, suddenly they began to wake up and say, we're not who we thought we were. We're not the idealists we used to be. Now the reason that that was successful is because it hit at the right time. But the danger of dealing with cultural blind spots is that if you hit it before its time, you're going to be ignored completely. It may cause a ripple, but people aren't going to go see it, they aren't going to buy your book, and you're going to lose out in that respect. You might put out a warning flag, but you'll be ahead of your time, too far ahead of your time, rather than avant-garde, as it were. And if you're too late, if somebody else has already got the idea, they can jump in there ahead of you, and suddenly you've got the second movie dealing with this, or the second book to come out dealing with something, and nobody wants to read it because they've already had their fill with someone else. Reception of plot. Favorite archetypal plots. We like to see certain stories told over and over again, whether it's particularly attached to a historical event or something that's newsworthy, or whether it's just a format that's vaguely familiar because that particular formula was what we found in a story we grew up with and have heard many times, and we like to see it retold again and again. Like, how many times have we seen variations of A Christmas Carol, the same story told over and over again in different clothing with different people and different settings? Now, all the story forms, again, they're all equal structurally, but we tend to come back to the same ones over and over again because they're familiar to us. They're childhood memories. They're cultural indoctrination that if we get too far away from experiencing that particular underlying structure, we feel withdrawal. We feel out of touch with our society. And we need to see those kinds of stories again, even if they're not about the same people or the same events. However, there's another way to evaluate the need for seeing particular kinds of stories told, and that's in the storytelling area. Reception of plot. Suppose there's a newsworthy event. Some famous person dies. Some tragedy occurs. Something happens that we need to work out. Why are all these TV movies successful? They're successful because we want to get it out of our system. We need to talk it through, work it through psychologically. We hear about it all over the news, but until we live it emotionally and can resolve it, put it to bed, we can't let it go, and it gives us a cultural inequity just by being in touch with society. Well, some movies examine these issues too. And here's a clip from the movie Alive. Alive was about that soccer team that ended up turning cannibalistic. Well, I'm not going to show you the cannibalistic part of it. That's why people went to it primarily, but also they went to it because it was one of the most extraordinary air crashes in history to that point that people actually survived. It was through the watching of this movie that many people were able to overcome their shock of the terror of what actually happened. So it performs a function, and from a storytelling standpoint, not only do you get to get it out of your system by creating such a piece, but you help a lot of other people, and along the way might even make a lot of money. Okay, now looking down at genre, how does reception affect genre? Well, here's an example. If you can come up with a social, political taboo, something that is not looked at intentionally, that people shy away from, and address it, then maybe you can deal with some kind of an overall genre realm in the setting or in the kind of experience that everyone stays away from, and make them face it. You can change society, you can bring something up to people, but when you're dealing with an area like that, often it has its initial impact, and after a while it seems rather tame.